The police received a call for help from a boy. When he arrived at the scene, he was shocked to discover it was his son. The pale winter sun hung low in the sky as Officer Michael Collins and Linda Morian made their way through the desolate streets of Pine Avenue, a neighborhood long abandoned by care and upkeep. The air outside was sharp, cold enough to sting, but the warmth inside the patrol car offered a fleeting sense of comfort. Linda glanced out the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she studied the neighborhood. "It's unusually quiet today," she remarked, her voice breaking the heavy silence that had settled in the car. Michael's eyes remained on the road ahead, but his mind wandered, unsettled. "Yeah, too quiet," he replied, his tone cautious. "Something doesn't feel right." He let the words hang in the air between them. Both knew that when things seemed too calm, it was often a sign that something else was lurking just beneath the surface. The radio crackled to life, shattering the stillness. "All units in the area of Pine Avenue, we have a 911 call." A child's voice, faint but clear, said only, "Send help," before the line went dead. The call came from 1234 Pine Avenue. "We've traced the location based on cell tower data. Over." Michael's stomach tightened as he turned to Linda, his expression hardening. She wasted no time pulling up the address on the GPS. "That's just a few blocks away," she said, already turning the wheel. "Let's go." 10-4, dispatch, Michael responded, his voice steady but his thoughts racing. "Unit 459 en route, ETA 3 minutes. The siren's wail pierced the silence of the winter afternoon, its shrill cry echoing down the empty streets. The patrol car weaved through the sparse traffic, the headlights slicing through the dim grey light of the afternoon. As they neared Pine Avenue, the world outside seemed to grow more desolate. Rusted cars sat abandoned along the curbs, their once bright colors now faded by years of neglect. The houses were in varying states of disrepair, some with windows boarded up, others with walls sagging under the weight of years of indifference. Michael's grip on the wheel tightened, and Linda drummed her fingers nervously on her leg. "Something's wrong," she muttered, her voice tight. Michael nodded, his senses sharpened. "Stay alert. We don't know what we're walking into." As they reached 1234 Pine Avenue, Michael's stomach sank. The house in front of them looked as if it had been forgotten by time. The peeling paint on the siding revealed the rotting wood beneath. Some windows were boarded up, others shattered, and the front porch sagged dangerously. The yard was overrun with weeds and littered with trash and debris. An old refrigerator, abandoned and rusting, sat on the curb, its door hanging open like a silent scream. Linda let out a low curse. "This place hasn't seen anyone in years." Michael's eyes scanned the property, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. "Stay sharp," he said quietly. "Could be squatters, or worse." They stepped out of the car, both officers instinctively reaching for their weapons as they approached the front door. Michael knocked twice, the sound of his fist hitting the wood echoing off the rotting walls. "Police! Is anyone home?" he called, his voice firm, but the silence that followed was suffocating. He listened, straining for any sound from within, but there was nothing. Linda tried again, louder this time. "This is the police. We've received a call for help from this address. If anyone's inside, please come to the door." Still, there was no answer. The silence hung in the air like a heavy fog. Michael looked at Linda, his face unreadable. "Let's try the door," he said, reaching for the handle. It didn't move. "It's locked," he reported, frustration creeping into his voice. They exchanged a brief glance, the tension between them palpable. Michael spoke into the radio. "Dispatch, Unit 459 at 1234. Pine Avenue. No response at the door. Requesting permission to enter." The radio crackled again. 10-4, Unit 459. Permission granted. Use caution." Michael nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. With Linda covering him, he stepped back from the door and tried once more to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. "It's solid," he muttered. "Let's check around back." They moved cautiously around the side of the house, pushing through the thick dead brush that had nearly overtaken the path. The backyard mirrored the front, neglected, desolate, a dumping ground for forgotten furniture and discarded items. Snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting the ground with a thin layer of white that made the scene look even more desolate. They paused for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. "Let's be ready for anything," Michael said quietly, his voice calm but steady. "We don't know what we'll find back here." Linda nodded, her hand resting once more on her holster, her every step calculated and deliberate as they continued on, ready for whatever awaited them in the cold, empty backyard. Michael nodded, but couldn't shake the unease that crept up his spine. Kneeling down, he pushed the weeds aside, his breath catching as he uncovered a rusted old tricycle. Scattered nearby were other forgotten toys, an abandoned plastic dump truck, a weathered baseball, and a frayed stuffed animal, its fabric torn and discolored. "Robin," Michael said quietly, his finger pointing to the scattered toys. Robin's eyes narrowed, a familiar tension creeping into her face. "Recent activity," she observed. "These haven't been out here for long." Michael stood, a cold chill creeping up his neck despite the sweltering heat. "Something's not right," he muttered. "We need to get inside." Back at the front of the house, Michael keyed his radio. "Dispatch, Unit 247. We've found signs of recent child activity, but there's no response inside. Requesting backup for forced entry." "Copy that. 247. Backup is en route. ETA is 5 minutes." As they waited, neighbors began peeking out from behind their curtains or stepping onto their porches. Some of them stared silently, their expressions unreadable. A few others shifted uncomfortably, watching the police with wary eyes. "Not exactly friendly," Robin remarked under her breath. Michael agreed with a nod. This neighborhood had a reputation for its hostility toward law enforcement, and he hoped it wouldn't escalate into something worse. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars rolled up, officers spilling out onto the grass. "What's going on?" asked Officer Jensen, a seasoned cop Michael had worked with before. Michael gave a quick rundown of what they'd discovered and the growing suspicion that something was seriously wrong. "We need to get in there now," Michael said. "That 911 call, if there's a kid in danger, every second counts." Jensen nodded, his face grim. "Let's do this by the book. Hernandez, Garcia, you two cover the back. Robin, you're with me for the entry. Michael, take points once we're in." Everyone fell into position, the weight of the situation settling over them. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, each second stretching longer as they prepared for what might lie behind that door. The neighborhood had gone eerily quiet, the only sounds the soft rustling of the leaves and the crackle of the police radio. "On 3, Jensen said, taking his place in front of the door. 1, 2, 3. With a violent crash, Jensen's boot smashed into the door. It splintered, the lock tearing free from the rotting frame. As the door flew open, a nauseating wave of stench rushed out, thick and rancid. Michael gagged but forced himself to breathe through his mouth as he stepped inside. "Police!" he shouted, his voice reverberating in the darkness. "Anyone here? Call out if you need help." The silence inside was oppressive. Michael switched on his flashlight, its beam slicing through the gloom. He stepped into what appeared to be the kitchen, though it was barely recognizable as such. The counters were covered in grime and old food containers, some mouldy takeout boxes left to fester in the corners. The sink overflowed with dishes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks, maybe months. A thick layer of grease coated every surface, giving the whole room a slick, slimy sheen under the harsh light. The refrigerator door was ajar, the inside dark and foul-smelling. Michael didn't dare look closely at what was inside. As he moved through the room, clouds of flies rose from various piles of rotting garbage. "Clear!" he called, his voice muffled by the arm he had pressed over his nose. "Clear here too," Robin's voice came from the living room. "But you need to see this." Michael carefully picked his way down the hallway, stepping around the debris. The living room was just as bad as the kitchen. Torn, stained furniture was scattered haphazardly around an old TV that hadn't worked in years. Empty liquor bottles were everywhere, their contents long gone. But it wasn't the state of the room that grabbed Michael's attention, it was what Robin was pointing to. On a dusty coffee table, an assortment of drug paraphernalia lay scattered: used syringes, burnt spoons, and small plastic baggies filled with remnants of white powder. "This looks like a serious meth problem," Linda remarked with a grim tone. Michael nodded silently, his jaw tight. The sight of the drug use, combined with the disturbing 911 call, painted a grim picture of what could be happening inside this house. "Let's check upstairs," he suggested. "Be careful. The floor doesn't look too steady." The stairs creaked under their weight as they ascended, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The second floor was cluttered with small rooms, each more chaotic than the last. They checked each one carefully, finding more traces of drug use but no sign of life, no sign of the child they feared was trapped here. After a thorough search, they met at the top of the stairs, Linda's frustration palpable. Could the call have come from another place? "Eh?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. Michael frowned, equally perplexed. "Maybe. Let's do one more sweep downstairs, then we'll radio in the possibility of a wrong address." But as they turned to head back down, a faint noise froze them in place. Barely audible, over the hum of flies and the creaking house, it was unmistakable. A child's voice, weak and desperate, called out from above. "I'm here. Please help." The raw desperation in that voice sent a chill racing down Michael's spine. He and Linda exchanged a quick, horror-stricken glance before dashing back up the stairs, guns drawn, ready for whatever nightmare awaited them. Heart racing, Michael bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, with Linda right behind him. They stopped at the top, listening intently. "Hello?" Michael called. "We're the police. Where are you?" For a moment only silence met them, then barely audible. "Here, please." Michael and Linda exchanged a look. The voice was coming from the far end of the hallway. They moved quickly but cautiously, checking each room as they went. One of the rooms led to a balcony. Michael stepped outside briefly, peering over the edge before noticing another door. He waved Linda over, and they made their way to it. The door was locked. "Stand back," Michael instructed, before delivering a powerful kick. The old wood splintered with a loud crack, but the door didn't open. He kicked again, and this time it flew open. Michael's flashlight beam swept the room, revealing a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the corner, chained to an old radiator, was a small boy. He was dressed in nothing but ragged blue shorts, his body emaciated and covered in bruises and sores. The child's head drooped to the side, and his eyes struggled to focus on the officers. Even in the dim light, Michael could see the hollowness in those eyes, the gaunt face of starvation, and the rough patches of hair on the boy's scalp, evidence of someone cutting it in a violent fit. But it was the face itself that hit Michael like a punch to the gut. Despite the horror of his condition, Michael recognized the boy, those eyes, the curve of his chin, the shape of his nose. The face belonged to someone he knew all too well. Oh, God! Michael gasped, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. Dean! The boy's cracked lips moved with visible effort. Dad, he murmured, barely able to speak. Michael's world seemed to shift. This was his son, the little boy he hadn't seen in 2 years, not since the divorce that tore his family apart. Of course I remember you, buddy, Michael choked out, his voice trembling. I'm here now. We're getting you out of here. As they began carefully making their way through the wreckage of the house, Michael's foot caught on something buried in the weeds. He stumbled, but caught himself just in time. You okay? Linda asked, reaching out to steady him. Michael nodded and bent down, brushing aside the thick weeds. His breath caught in his throat as he revealed a small, rusted tricycle half hidden in the tall grass. Nearby, he noticed a broken plastic dump truck, a faded baseball, and a tattered stuffed animal scattered across the yard. Linda, he whispered, gesturing toward the abandoned toys. Linda's face tightened as she looked at them. Recent activity, she said quietly. These haven't been out here that long. A chill ran down Michael's spine, and it wasn't from the cold. Something's very wrong here, he muttered. We need to get inside that house. Back at the front of the house, Michael keyed his radio again. Dispatch, this is Unit 247. We've found evidence of recent child activity, but no response from inside. Requesting backup for forced entry. Copy that, Unit 247, came the reply. Backup is on the way. ETA 5 minutes. As they waited, neighbors began peeking out of their windows, some venturing out onto their porches, observing the scene with wary interest. Not exactly a welcoming crowd, Linda remarked quietly. Michael nodded. This neighborhood had a long history of distrust toward law enforcement. He only hoped their presence wouldn't make things worse. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived, their occupants joining Michael and Linda. What's the situation? Asked Officer Jensen, a seasoned cop Michael had worked with before. Michael quickly briefed him and the others on what they'd discovered and their concerns. We need to get in there, now, Michael urged. That 911 call. If there's a kid inside, every second counts. Jensen nodded. All right, let's do this by the book. Hernandez, Garcia, you cover the back. Linda, you're with me on the front. Michael, you take point once we're inside. The officers took their positions, and Michael's heart raced as he steeled himself for whatever lay inside. The neighborhood was eerily quiet now, with only the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze and the crackling of radios breaking the silence. On 3. Jensen said, positioning himself in front of the door. 1, 2, 3. With a deafening crash, Jensen's boot smashed into the door. The old wood splintered and the lock tore free from the decaying frame. As the door swung open, a wave of putrid stench rushed out. Urine, feces, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Michael fought the urge to gag, forcing himself to breathe through his mouth as he stepped inside. Police! He shouted, his voice reverberating in the darkness. Anyone here? Call out if you need help. Only silence answered. Michael's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the squalor inside. The room he entered looked like a kitchen, though barely recognizable. Every surface was caked with filth, moldy food containers, take-out boxes, and piles of garbage covered the counters and floor. The sink was clogged with months-old dishes. The refrigerator door hung open, dark and foul. Michael didn't dare look inside. Flies swarmed around the piles of rotting trash. "Clear!" he called, his voice muffled as he held his shirt over his nose. From the living room, Linda's voice called out, "Clear here, too. But you need to see this." Michael made his way through the cluttered hallway to find Linda standing in the living room. The room was in as much disarray as the kitchen, with stained furniture scattered around a television that hadn't worked in years. Empty liquor bottles littered the floor, but it was what Linda was pointing to that drew Michael's attention. As Linda called for immediate medical assistance, Michael knelt beside his son, his hands trembling as he examined the heavy chain and dog collar that tethered Dean to the radiator. The metal had scraped his skin raw, leaving deep red marks around his neck and ankle. "Water," Dean whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. Michael's gaze shifted to a nearly empty plastic bottle lying nearby, the only sign of any care the boy had received. Gently, he lifted the bottle to Dean's lips, allowing him to sip slowly. "Easy, buddy," Michael whispered. "Help is on the way. You're safe now." As the sound of sirens grew louder, Michael struggled to control the mix of fury and guilt rising inside him. How could this happen? How had Dean managed to make the call? The questions began to spiral in his mind, but his regret over missing the opportunity to fight harder for custody after Sarah's drunk driving incident took the forefront. He shoved these thoughts aside. Now wasn't the time for what-ifs. All that mattered was getting Dean the help he needed, and fast. As the paramedics readied to move Dean onto the stretcher, Michael's eyes fell on something wedged beneath the radiator. He crouched down and retrieved a battered old flip phone. "Linda," he called softly, holding it up. "I think I know how he made the call." Linda rushed over, her eyes widening when she saw the phone. "The boy," she murmured. Michael nodded, a mix of pride and sorrow on his face. But then a new wave of questions washed over him. Why didn't Dean call sooner? How did he even manage to get the phone? Linda's voice was low, full of concern. "Michael, look at him. He's severely malnourished and dehydrated. It probably took every last bit of strength just to make that one call." Michael's jaw tightened as the gravity of the situation set in. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice heavy with understanding. And he must have been terrified to do it, terrified of being caught. Linda nodded grimly. "Once Dean's stable, we can ask him exactly how he managed." "My guess? He probably reached for the phone from that table, desperate enough to risk it even with the collar around his neck." She gestured toward a table not far from the radiator. If there were people in the house, using the phone would have been a huge risk. But if he was alone, it's possible. "The phone might have important details to help us track down whoever did this," Michael said, his voice hardening with resolve. His gaze softened as he looked down at his son. Dean was barely conscious, but the boy had found the strength to call for help, to reach out, even when it seemed like he was on the brink of death. "He's a fighter," Linda said quietly, a hint of admiration in her voice. "Just like his dad." As the paramedics carefully loaded Dean into the ambulance, Michael slipped the old phone into an evidence bag, understanding its value not just as a piece of evidence, but as a symbol of his son's remarkable will to survive. Despite everything, Dean had found a way to reach out. He had held on long enough for help to arrive. Michael climbed into the ambulance, his heart heavy with the weight of what his son had endured. Yet, beneath the sorrow, there was a determination burning in him. He was going to get to the bottom of this. The road ahead would be long, but he would walk it by Dean's side, helping him heal and rebuild the life that had been stolen from him. Meanwhile, the house was swarming with activity as more officers arrived on the scene. Michael stayed close to Dean, speaking softly to reassure him while the paramedics worked to stabilize him. One of the EMTs spoke up, his voice serious. "His blood pressure is dangerously low. He's severely dehydrated and malnourished." "We need to get him in the ambulance now," another EMT added. "He's going to need intensive care. And his limbs." The young man gently checked Dean's joints. There might be dislocations or damage from overextension. We need trauma care on standby. The EMT quickly dialed the hospital, preparing them for Dean's arrival. Michael's throat tightened as he nodded, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm going with him," he said, his words firm, leaving no room for argument. As they prepared to move Dean to the ambulance, Michael heard a commotion outside. He looked toward the front yard and saw a crowd had gathered, drawn in by the sirens and flashing lights. Some onlookers were shouting accusations, accusing the police of brutality and overreach. Michael's grip tightened, but he didn't let it distract him. His focus was entirely on his son. They would face whatever came next, but Dean needed him now more than ever. "I've got the crowd," Jensen assured Michael, giving his shoulder a firm squeeze. "You focus on your son. Take Linda with you." Michael gave a brief nod, barely registering the words, as he followed the paramedics out of the room. They were lifting Dean onto a stretcher, moving with careful precision as they made their way downstairs. Michael couldn't help but notice how light his son seemed. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. The boy was so fragile, and it made his heart twist in ways he couldn't describe. Once outside, Michael used his body to shield Dean from the gathering crowd. He could hear the whispers, the sharp intakes of breath, as the onlookers caught sight of the child's condition, but he blocked it all out. His sole focus was getting Dean into the waiting ambulance. Inside the vehicle, Michael grasped Dean's hand, his fingers trembling as the paramedics worked quickly. IVs were inserted, monitors beeped, and the team moved with efficient precision, but their serious faces told Michael all he needed to know. His son was in bad shape. As the ambulance sped down the streets, sirens wailing, Michael's mind raced with guilt and regret. How long had Dean been suffering, he wondered. Why hadn't I pushed harder to see him after the divorce? The thought clawed at him, and the guilt was almost suffocating. "Dad!" Dean's weak voice cut through Michael's spiraling thoughts, grounding him. He looked down at his son, his heart breaking at the pain he saw in Dean's eyes. "I'm here, buddy," Michael whispered, squeezing Dean's hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Dean's glazed eyes met his. Despite everything, the boy managed a weak smile. "You came," he whispered. "I knew you'd come." The words cracked Michael wide open. He felt the sting of tears, but held them back, promising to never let his son down again. "I'm so sorry it took me so long," Michael murmured. "But I'm here now, and I'm never letting go. Rest easy, son. Just a little longer." As the ambulance pushed through the busy city streets, Michael silently vowed to make things right. He was going to fight for custody, hold the responsible parties accountable, and do everything in his power to help Dean heal. This was only the beginning of a long road, but Michael wasn't going to waste the second chance he had been given. The sirens screamed as the ambulance tore through the streets, and inside, Michael's grip tightened on Dean's hand. His gaze never left his son's pale face, while the paramedics worked around them. "BP's still low but stabilizing," one of the EMTs called. "Pulse is weak but steady." Michael nodded, barely hearing them. His mind was still reeling, grief, rage, guilt, all tangled together. He thought back to the last 2 years, to the bitter custody battle that had followed Sarah's DUI. He'd fought hard, but in the end, Sarah had used his long hours on the force against him. The court had given him only limited visitation rights, which had quickly faded away. Dean, sick, we're too busy, it's not a good time, excuses that Michael had allowed to push him further away. Eventually, he had stopped pushing. He had told himself it was better for Dean to have stability, but now he realized how wrong he had been. That mistake The inaction was crushing him now. A paramedic's voice broke through his thoughts. "Sir, we're about 2 minutes out from the hospital. Trauma team is standing by." Michael squeezed Dean's hand, trying to steady himself. "We're almost there, buddy. The doctors are going to take care of you," he whispered, even though Dean remained unconscious, far from hearing his reassurances. The ambulance screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance, and Michael braced himself for what lay ahead. He knew these next few hours and days would be critical, but he was ready to be there for Dean, no matter what. The back doors of the ambulance flew open, and a flurry of doctors and nurses swarmed around the gurney. Michael tried to follow as they wheeled Dean into the ER, but a nurse's hand on his arm stopped him. "You need to let them work, sir," the nurse said gently. "I promise we'll update you as soon as we can." Helplessly, Michael watched as they disappeared through the double doors. It felt like a piece of his heart was being pulled away with them. He slumped against the wall, the rush of adrenaline fading and leaving only exhaustion in its wake. A familiar voice pierced through the fog of his thoughts. "Michael." Michael stood by the hospital entrance, watching as Linda jogged toward him from the parked police cruiser. Her footsteps were hurried, her face tense with concern. "How's he doing? Any updates yet?" she asked, her breath visible in the cold air. Michael ran a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. "They just got him in." "God, Linda. He looked so fragile, so broken. I can't believe this is happening." Linda placed a firm hand on his shoulder, offering what little comfort she could. "We'll figure it out, partner. But right now, we need to focus on Dean. Have you reached out to anyone? Your ex-wife?" The mention of his ex-wife snapped Michael back to reality. He had duties to fulfill, calls to make. He was both a father and a police officer, and somehow he had to balance both. "I'll take care of it," he said, his voice low as they both walked into the bustling waiting room. The scene inside the ER waiting area was chaotic, but to Michael, everything moved at a crawl. Every second felt like an eternity. His mind raced as he tried to prepare for whatever news awaited him. Linda sat beside him, offering a quiet presence as she too waited, her attention on the busy room around them. The minutes stretched, feeling longer with every passing moment. Finally, a doctor in scrubs approached them, his expression serious but not devoid of hope. "Family of Nathan Rodriguez?" he called. Michael stood up quickly, his heart pounding. "Yes, I'm his father. How is he?" The doctor paused, his face somber, but not without a glimmer of optimism. "Your son is in critical condition, but he's stable for now. We're treating him for severe malnutrition, dehydration, and several untreated fractures. He's also showing signs of joint damage in his upper limbs. We're moving him to the pediatric ICU for closer monitoring. He'll need extensive care and rehabilitation, but kids are incredibly resilient. We're hopeful with the right treatment." Michael felt his knees weaken, but Linda was there, steadying him. The doctor continued, explaining the details of Dean's injuries. "We're also going to do an X-ray to further assess the joint damage. He'll be scheduled for that shortly." "When can I see him?" Michael's voice cracked with emotion. "We're getting him settled in now. A nurse will come get you in about 30 minutes. Just know we need to keep him calm. His body has been through a lot. Rest is crucial." "Thank you, doctor," Michael managed, his voice barely above a whisper as the doctor left. He sank back into his seat, his head in his hands. Linda gently squeezed his shoulder. "He's alive, Michael. He's getting the best care we can offer. That's what matters." Michael nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, but the relief of knowing Dean was alive was tempered by the horror of what his son had gone through. Guilt gnawed at him. He should have been there more, should have seen the signs. He should have protected him. A nurse arrived to escort them to Dean's room, and Michael braced himself for what he would find. The pediatric ICU was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors. Dean lay in a bed that seemed far too large for his small frame. Tubes and wires were connected to various machines, his body battered and broken. Michael approached the bed slowly, his heart breaking again at the sight of his son. Dean's eyes fluttered open as he sensed his father's presence, a faint, cracked smile appearing on his lips. "Dad?" His voice was barely audible. "I'm here, buddy," Michael whispered, leaning in closer. "You're in the hospital. You're going to be okay." Dean's sunken eyes struggled to focus on Michael's face. "I tried to be brave," he murmured, his voice a faint echo of the words Michael used to say to him. Michael felt his chest tighten. "You were so brave, Dean. Braver than anyone should ever have to be. I'm so proud of you." As Michael sat by Dean's bedside, a doctor in a white coat knocked gently before entering. "Mr. Rodriguez?" The doctor introduced himself. "I'm Dr. Patel, the pediatric radiologist. We need to take Nathan for some additional scans. We're concerned about joint damage." Michael nodded, worry creeping into his expression. "Of course, whatever he needs." Dean stirred slightly at the noise, his eyes opening slowly. "Dad?" he mumbled, his voice filled with a hint of fear. "I'm here, buddy," Michael reassured him, holding his son's hand tightly. "The doctors just need to do some more tests. Is it okay if I go with you?" Dean gave a weak nod, his body relaxing just a little. "Please don't leave me," he whispered. "I won't, Dean," Michael promised. "I'm right here." A nurse arrived with a wheelchair, and they carefully helped Dean into it. Linda, who had been standing quietly by the door, offered her support and walked alongside them as they made their way to the radiology department. Michael pushed Dean's wheelchair, and Dr. Patel explained the procedure to them as they moved through the halls. Linda's presence was a quiet comfort, and Michael appreciated her steady support. The scan itself took about an hour, but Michael never left Dean's side. He held his son's hand the entire time, offering soft words of reassurance. Afterward, they returned to a small consultation room to wait for the results. Dr. Patel entered, his expression grim. "We've found evidence of joint damage in Nathan's shoulders and elbows," he explained. "It appears to be due to overextension, most likely from untreated fractures." Michael's chest tightened with frustration and anger as he thought about the pain his son had endured. "What does this mean for his recovery?" he asked, his voice edged with concern. Dr. Patel offered a reassuring smile, though it was tinged with caution. "With the right physical therapy, we're optimistic about a full recovery, but it will require time and a lot of patience." Michael absorbed the information, nodding slowly. As they were processing it, Linda spoke up, her voice soft but steady. "Dean, sweetie," she began gently, "I know this is tough, but can you remember what happened? Were you reaching for something?" Dean furrowed his brow, concentrating. The phone," he murmured. "It was on the table. I had to stretch really far to grab it." Michael and Linda exchanged a quiet, knowing glance. The very object that had been Dean's connection to the world had also led to his injury. Just then, Michael's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the message from Jensen. "We got them. 2 arrests at the house. Woman claims to be Dean's mother. Call me when you can." Michael stared at the screen for a moment, weighing the decision. He looked at Linda and said, "I need to make a call." Linda nodded. "Go ahead. I'll stay here with Dean." Michael stepped into the hallway and dialed Jensen's number. "Talk to me," he said as soon as she picked up. "What's going on?" Jensen's voice was tight, with barely contained fury. "It's bad, Michael. We found Sarah, your ex-wife, and a man she says is her boyfriend. The house was a mess, full of drug paraphernalia, mostly meth. They're both clearly users." Michael's head swam with the news, and he pressed a hand against the wall to steady himself. "And Dean? Did they say anything about what they did to him?" Jensen's voice grew colder, her disgust evident. The boyfriend didn't hold back. He was disturbingly open about everything. "Michael, you need to come down to the station. It's better you hear it from them yourself." Michael's blood ran cold. "I need to see them. I need to look them in the eye and ask them how they could do this." "I'll see you soon," Jensen said, her tone firm but sympathetic. Michael stood still for a moment, the weight of his responsibilities pulling at him. He knew he needed to go to the station, but the thought of leaving Dean was almost unbearable. He walked back into the room where his son lay, looking up at him with trusting eyes. "Dean, buddy," Michael began, kneeling beside the bed. "I need to go to the police station for a little while. Is it all right if Linda stays with you?" Linda smiled reassuringly. "Of course, Dean. I'm your dad's partner, and we do everything together. I won't leave your side." Dean hesitated for a moment, uncertainty flashing in his eyes, but then he nodded bravely. "Okay, Dad. You'll come back soon, right?" "As soon as I can," Michael promised, leaning down to kiss Dean's forehead. "I love you, buddy." "I love you too, Dad," Dean replied quietly. As Michael stood up to leave, Linda called out after him, "Take the cruiser with you, but be careful. You're too close to this case, Michael. Don't let your emotions get the best of you. Your career isn't worth risking over this." "I'll be careful," Michael said, his voice firm yet tinged with gratitude. "Thanks for everything, Linda." With that, Michael stepped out of the room, the weight of his dual roles as a father and a lawman pressing heavily on him. He knew he had to face what awaited him at the station, no matter how much it tore him apart. The need for justice, for answers, was a force he couldn't ignore. Despite Linda's warnings, Michael couldn't calm his racing thoughts as he arrived at the precinct. The familiar hum of activity in the station felt alien to him, like he was moving through a dream. Officers nodded to him as he passed, word of Dean's rescue having spread quickly through the department. Jensen was waiting for him at the door to the holding cells, her face a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Michael, are you sure about this? You don't have to do this now," she said, her voice soft with understanding. He met her gaze, his face set in grim determination. "I need to see them, Jensen. I need to understand." With a sigh, Jensen led him down the sterile corridor, the harsh fluorescent lights casting an unsettling glow on everything they passed. It felt like an unspoken warning, as if the very walls were suffocating him in their cold, unforgiving light. They arrived at the holding area, and Michael's breath caught in his chest. Sarah was sitting on a hard, narrow cot, her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked nothing like the woman he had once known, the woman he had loved. Her face had hollowed out, cheeks sunken, her skin marked with the unmistakable signs of long-term meth abuse. She stared ahead, unblinking, her eyes vacant, as if she didn't even notice their presence. Beside her sat a man Michael didn't recognize, a wiry figure with a patchy beard and greasy hair. He wasn't focused on Sarah, though. The moment Michael and Linda stepped into the cell, the man's eyes locked onto Michael's with a hostile glare. "Well, well, if it isn't the hero cop," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Here to gloat, are you?" Michael's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the bars of the cell. His voice was thick with anger as he barely managed to croak out, "Why? How could you do this? To a child? To my son?" The man let out a small, mocking laugh. "Ah, you must be the father, huh?" he said, stretching lazily on the cot. "It was me who locked the kid up. Had to shut him up, you know. Always whining, always in the way. Disturbing me and my girlfriend's peace. We don't care if you take him. He's a burden anyway." Michael's pulse was racing. "How long have you kept him locked in that room?" he demanded. The man shrugged nonchalantly. "What? You want me to apologize? I could have called you, but then you'd probably have the cops sniffing around. We've got plenty of stuff in the house you wouldn't want to find out about." He grinned, enjoying Michael's reaction. "You're dumber than I thought." Michael's grip on the bars tightened, his whole body shaking with barely contained rage. "You nearly killed him," he growled. "He's 8 years old. He was 6 when I left him." His voice cracked with the weight of it all, but he still couldn't look away from the man. The boyfriend's grin widened, and he leaned in, his voice low and mocking. "You want to know how it all started? How your perfect little family came apart? It was just another night at the bar. Your wife was there, looking all sad and lonely. She told me she was divorced, said her husband was a drunk, that he'd killed himself in a car accident. She seemed like she wanted a good time." Michael's fists clenched tighter at his sides, but he kept silent, letting the man continue. "Then I introduced her to meth," the boyfriend chuckled, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "She was hooked from that first hit. You should have seen her face. It was like she'd found religion or something." He leaned back, enjoying the moment. "After that, she couldn't get enough. Of the drug. Or of me. We've been together ever since. Guess she found something better than playing house with a self-righteous cop and taking care of a kid all on her own." Michael's voice was barely audible, but the fury behind it was clear. "You destroyed her. You took her away from her son." The man shrugged, clearly indifferent. "Hey, I didn't force her to do anything. She made her choice. If you'd been a better husband, a better father, maybe things would have been different. But you weren't, were you? You think you're better than me, but you're not. Not really. You've got your problems too." Michael's restraint snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing the bars with one hand, his other reaching for the man's shirt. "You son of a—" Strong hands pulled him back, and Michael struggled for a moment before realizing it was Jensen and a couple of other officers. "Michael, stop!" Linda's voice was urgent in his ear. "This isn't helping anyone, least of all Dean." The boyfriend's laughter echoed around the cell block as Michael was dragged away. "That's right. Run away. Go play daddy to the kid you abandoned. Let's see how long that lasts this time." Linda, holding Michael back, kept him steady, but he could feel his body trembling with the rage and guilt that had surged within him. The man's words had cut too deep, dredging up everything Michael had been struggling with since finding Dean. The guilt. The shame. "Michael," Linda said softly, her voice a grounding force. "Don't let him get to you. He's just trying to push your buttons. Remember, Dean needs you." The mention of his son's name brought him back to the present, as if dousing him with cold water. Michael released his grip, stumbling back a few steps. He glanced at Sarah one last time, searching her face for any trace of the woman he had once loved. But there was nothing. He turned away. The boyfriend's mocking laughter followed them as they walked away from the cells. Jensen placed a comforting hand on Michael's shoulder. "You okay, partner?" Michael shook his head, a hollow look in his eyes. "No," he admitted. "But I will be. I have to be. For Dean's sake." They reached the main area of the station and Michael paused, taking a deep breath. I'm sorry for losing it back there, he said quietly, his voice rough with the weight of the day. I need to make sense of everything, but I don't think I ever will. Michael's voice was thick with frustration as he spoke. Linda nodded in understanding. Some things just can't be explained, Michael, she said softly. What matters now is moving forward. Dean needs you to be strong. At that moment, Michael's phone buzzed. A text from the hospital flashed on the screen. Is everything okay at the station? Dean's looking for you. Michael felt a small, genuine smile tug at the corners of his lips for the first time in days. I've got to go, he told Linda, his voice steady with resolve. I need to get back to my son. As he walked out of the station, each step toward his car felt like a step toward something he had lost, but was determined to reclaim. Every mile he drove toward the hospital, toward Dean, reinforced his growing determination. Whatever it took, he would help his son heal, physically and emotionally. They would rebuild their lives, one day at a time. The pediatric ward was hushed as Michael made his way down the hall to Dean's room. The soft beeping of monitors, coupled with the quiet shuffle of nurses' shoes on linoleum, filled the pre-dawn silence. Outside Dean's door, he paused for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself before entering. Inside, Dean was talking to Linda, his blue eyes, so much like Michael's, wide awake despite the late hour. A nurse was adjusting his IV, speaking to him in soft, calming tones. Look who's here, the nurse said with a smile as Michael stepped into the room. I told you your dad would be back soon. Dean's face lit up, a flicker of his old smile breaking through the exhaustion and pain. Dad, he said, his voice weak but clearer than before. You came back. Michael's heart clenched at the surprise in his son's voice, a stark reminder of the time they had lost. Of course I did, buddy, Michael replied, settling into the chair beside the bed. I promised I'd be here, didn't I? And I always keep my promises. The nurse finished her checks and quietly excused herself, followed by Linda, leaving father and son alone. For a few moments, there was silence between them, the weight of everything that had happened hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Dean spoke, his voice soft. I missed you, Dad. I wasn't sure if you'd remember me. Michael's eyes welled with tears, and he reached out to gently hold Dean's small hand. Dean, listen to me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I have thought about you every single day since I last saw you. There hasn't been a moment when I didn't miss you, when I didn't wish I could see you. Dean's lower lip trembled. But you never came, he whispered. Mum said, she said you didn't want me anymore. Michael felt a sharp pain in his chest at those words. They cut deeper than anything he had felt in years. Oh, buddy, he murmured, wiping a tear from Dean's cheek. That was never true, not for a single second. I wanted nothing more than to be with you, but things between your mum and me were complicated. Do you remember when I used to visit every weekend? Your mum would say I only brought problems, that I was upsetting you, that it was affecting your school and your sleep. Dean nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. I thought maybe it was better if I didn't show up, Michael continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have fought harder, should have found a way. I'm so sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. Tears slipped down Dean's face, and Michael wiped them away with his thumb, trying to offer him comfort. I'm here now, he said softly. And I promise you, Dean, I'm not going anywhere. We're going to get through this together, okay? Dean nodded, his small hand squeezing Michael's tighter. What's going to happen now? Dean asked, a hint of fear in his voice. "Where's Mom?" "And Lucas, her boyfriend." Michael took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Your mum is safe now. She's at my station. The police are still investigating what happened, but I can assure you she'll be placed in rehab to recover from the drugs and that man. You don't need to worry about him. You won't have to see him again." Michael's hand moved gently through Dean's hair, a gesture meant to offer comfort. "You don't have to keep talking about it, son," he said softly. "I know it was hard. But I promise you, the police will make sure he never hurts anyone again. He'll pay for what he's done." Michael leaned in closer, his voice steady, full of promise. "What matters now is you, Dean. We're going to focus on making you strong and healthy again, and I'll be right here with you every step of the way." Dean swallowed hard, the weight of his fear and uncertainty lifting, if only a little, as he listened to Michael's words. "And after?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Where will I go?" Michael's tone was firm, filled with a certainty that felt like a lifeline. "You'll come home with me," he said. "We'll find a new place, just you and me. A fresh start, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure you're safe, Dean. I promise you, I will never let anything happen to you again." Dean's eyes softened, a flicker of hope stirring within him. "You want me to live with you?" "More than anything in the world, buddy," Michael replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I know it's scary, but we'll do this together. Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out." Dean nodded slowly, a faint, hopeful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible as he began to relax, his eyelids growing heavier with each passing moment. As Dean drifted into a peaceful sleep, Michael watched him closely, his heart full of love and determination. He sat back in his chair, letting the quiet fill the room for a moment. His mind began to turn over the road ahead, custody battles, therapy appointments, and the search for a new home. It was a long road, but Michael was ready to face it, ready to do whatever it took to give Dean the life he deserved. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. Linda stepped inside, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Michael, settling into the chair next to him. "How's he doing?" she asked, her voice low, her gaze moving to Dean, still sleeping. "Better," Michael replied, his voice steady but soft. "He's still got a long way to go, but he's strong. He'll make it through this." Linda gave a small nod, studying Michael's face closely. "And you?" she asked, concerned in her voice. Michael sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Honestly, I'm scared, angry. I feel guilty too, but mostly I'm just grateful. Grateful that he's alive and that I get this chance to make things right." Linda offered him a warm smile. "You're going to be a great dad, Michael," she said softly. "Dean's lucky to have you." Michael gave a wry smile, though there was a depth to his expression. "I hope you're right. I've made mistakes. Plenty of them." Linda reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We all have. What matters is what happens next. And I know you. You'll give him everything you've got." They sat in silence for a while, sipping their coffee, both watching the first light of morning begin to filter through the hospital window. The quiet was comforting, a small oasis of peace amidst the uncertainty. Michael broke the silence gently. "Linda?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Yeah?" she replied, turning to him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I would have gotten through all of this without you." Linda smiled, her grip on his shoulder tightening for a brief moment. "That's what partners are for, Michael," she said softly. "Don't worry. I'll be here for whatever you and Dean need." As Linda left, To begin her shift, Michael turned his gaze back to Dean. The boy's small form seemed so fragile, yet Michael could see the strength in him, the resilience that had kept him going through everything. "We're going to be okay, buddy," Michael whispered, squeezing Dean's hand gently. "It won't be easy, but we'll do it together." The new day had begun, and with it, Michael felt a sense of calm wash over him. The journey ahead would be long, but with love and patience, he and Dean would build a new life, one step at a time. As the sun rises on this new chapter for Michael and Dean, we see that love, hope, and resilience can truly help us rebuild our lives, no matter how dark the past may have been. It's a reminder that no matter what we go through, there's always a way forward, as long as we have each other. Thank you so much for joining us on this emotional journey today. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know how you think their journey will unfold. Remember, no matter the challenges we face, we're never truly alone. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care, everyone.